push the question that I have a bit further. But Bruno, hi, nice to see you.
Hi, I'm Bruno. My film was Flies. That was a kind of a personal reflection on my experiences dealing with obsessive compulsive disorder.
Hi, hello. I'm Todd Edward Herman, and my film was Cabinet. It was shuffling together the images of my father passing and my daughter being born.
Oh, hello. Good. Perfect. Thank you. And maybe Todd, I'll press this question a bit, and I can elaborate on it. There's something about blurriness and clarity that's in play in these films, and sort of a frustrating and exquisite twist of the question of what are we really able to show and what can we see. There's a privilege of clarity that belongs to a presumption that truth comes from the ability to really see. And I wonder about your position or a choice to make things blurred. You know, there's something about that that's more powerful than just a technique. I'm curious about that.
I mean, first of all, I just want to say thank you for curating a really wonderful program. I think that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. This one, in my opinion, was really lovely. And, nailed it. So thank you. Appreciate that. Just, every other film held every other film in the show. So that's on you.
Well, and the programming committee very committed to this weaving practice.
Yeah. So, and hi to all the filmmakers and Kali, it's surprised to see you there. Good to see you there. So I feel like with the sections of the film Cabinet of with my dad, he was slowing down for many years and was just thanks. He's like the most tolerant of me always being the camera to photographing him. And I felt like for maybe a decade, it was an inadvertent rehearsal for shooting this film because he was pretty immobile, just like losing energy, and that profile of him in the window was pretty iconic. That's where he was. So that said, he was okay with me being around. My mom was okay with me being around during his passing. It was fast and furious, and I just shot as a way for me to both stay present, which I'd say maybe is the focused part, and to keep a distance, which maybe is an out of focus, blurry part. Although when I did get to view the footage, months after he passed, it was so clear. I mean, so vivid, and it was really unlike what I was experiencing. And I mean, to your question, how do we know what we're seeing, or what do we think we're photographing? I was just reading about this guy, Ted Sirios, who did his thoughtography. I really felt like all my images were going to look like that, but they were just so irritatingly clear and vivid, and didn't show any of the emotions I was feeling. And I just had to put that food away for quite a long time. When I looked at it again, I just started burying it in filters, and up res, low, down resing, and to get to a point where it was a little more abstract that I could actually look at it. It allowed me a gateway to to explore my emotions a little bit more fully, rather than being just shutting my eyes that it was too graphic. I mean, in what we see online, it wasn't too graphic. But it was too graphic for me. It was too close. So I think that's one one aspect of the blurriness kind of dichotomy, the like paradox of burying it, pushing it away further and further in an effort for me to get closer to it.
Your film and Felicity's as well, Kelly and Bruno too, showed us things that are so personal, and really, there's almost like HIPAA violations to imagine that you are completely in sort of control of Felicity. I'm very interested in the scene in the office and what work you did to imagine what that would look like. It sounds like.
Yeah, this question is actually, I would say, maybe one of the main guiding ideas of what I was really trying to work with was how to convey almost like the impossibility of the situation, the unknowingness when you're diagnosed with something like this. And so I think that was coming through. I hope it was coming through. Particularly, I mean, I'm thinking about like just the way that I used the text and the font, right? Like the spacing, like that felt so, for me, just incredibly representative of what my doctor's medical records look like. Like they are just mumbo jumbo mess, like, and half the time they're spitting. You have to learn a new language when you're diagnosed with something like this. You're thrown in. So much of it is we don't know until we know. And you're just kind of in the dark. I was walking around thinking I was going to die for 4 months before I actually got the answer that it was a lower stage disease. But yeah, the scene in the doctor's office was just another checkup that I have to do every 6 months. And I would say at least once a year, I find a new lump that is always suspicious, and we have to start the whole game all over again of biopsies and scans and waiting and sitting in dread and just not knowing if it's come back or not.
In sort of conversation with that, I think, Callie, things that you split between have a lot to do sort of with Felicity's movement as well in this film series. Can you talk a bit about the slides that we were privy to? Or
Yeah, so this film is a part of like a larger collective called the Abortion Clinic Film Collective, which I was really excited to be a part of. And I kind of got the idea from, I have family in North Carolina, and we're Indigenous, not to North Carolina, but that's where they are now. And I was kind of just researching. I knew it was kind of like a hostile area for reproductive health in general. So I wanted to see how that affected people on Indigenous reservations and if they had their own kind of process or way to go about women's health, reproductive care, or abortion. So I did my research online and found a woman who was working in public health on her reservation. And, reproductive health is private to everyone, but especially abortion as well. And then to this community that, I am a part of in a way, but not a part of their tribe. So kind of letting me into their community was really special. So I wanted to keep the anonymous nature of it just so I didn't feel like I was exploiting anybody or like exploiting their practices that they have for themselves that could be, I don't know, regulated or taken away. So that's where I kind of wanted to put my voice first. So they were protected, and I just kept little bits of the woman I worked with the most at the beginning and the end, and in the middle, just to kind of have her presence there. But I wanted to withhold or like keep the safety of this community at the forefront.
one question directed to Bruno, and then I'd love to open it to the audience if anyone has questions. Bruno, I'm thinking about perspective quite a bit in your film and what you choose to focus on and where we get to see sort of intimacies in hair, the edge of a sidewalk. There are points that are so striking, and I'm curious about that juxtaposed also with the home movie footage that you include.
Yeah, I think the question of visuality was central to me since the beginning of this project. It was, to me, it felt like a challenge to try to visually represent something that is very personal to me and that feels more like a feeling, an experience. It's not something I tried to convey something that was not very, instructional or stereotypical. And I felt like the film carries this two different textures, like a more kind of rational explanation, perhaps, of my experience with the voice, and then a more sensorial and a more metaphorical understanding of how that feels with the images. It feels more like, because to me, it's something that is very rational, but also irrational at the same time. So I feel like this tension kind of waves through the film.
Mhm.
Images.
And I think maybe all of these create sort of an abstract from things that exist. It's not animated. You're not creating
Right.
image with a felicity. You have some sort of layering, but these are all things that are true. They're there.
Yeah, I think just back on that point of the HIPAA violation, right? Like,
Mm.
I think what we're all doing here is actually just allowing people to see the uncomfortable truths that are usually swept under the rug. I mean, I think particularly now with, Instagram and TikTok and Facebook, like the social media sort of way of presenting these, I almost want to call them trends, but like people being honest about what they're living through. There's still a lot of the turn towards like coloring everything with positive thinking, and we really just forget
Literally
to,
filtering.
yeah, and I think we forget to honor the truth of the grief that a lot of us have to hold with the reality that something like a diagnosis or watching a loved one die, just it totally uproots your entire life.
Yes. Well, on those questions of free will, that there are things that are beyond our control, that regardless of the law, someone who is pregnant might be seeking an abortion. If you want to ignore a thought, it's sometimes not as easy as all of that. It's here. Are there any questions from the audience? JJ?
Yes, hi. Callie, Bruno, Felicity, Todd, thank you very much for your work. It's deeply appreciated. So my question actually, I had it formulated before Felicity, your recent intervention just now, but actually now I think that it actually fits perfectly. This notion of the opacity of the encounter. Like oftentimes things need to be framed in black and white just to sort of like people maneuver through the landscape that we currently inhabit, no? Either positive thinking or, catastrophism or something like that. I think that these works, not only in thematics, but also formally create these really interesting, this languaging, I'll say. So like my question was originally going to be about language as aesthetic, like there's a lot of these works that, for example, Felicity, in your work, use text directly on the screen in this very important way. And then Callie, in your work, for example, there's a lot of voiceover and you have all this kind of more abstract languaging. Bruno, you go into this haptic kind of element, and then Todd, you do this kind of like, I don't know how to call it, maybe a little bit more of a, not, I wouldn't call it obfuscation, no, but like, like the layering, the opacification or whatever. And so my question is more of an open-ended one. If any of these ideas resonate, it's like, how do you see in that encounter with the fringe of the emotion or the fringe of the topic, what was it that led you to make that decision? You know, like to like either go veer in one direction or the other, or the juxtaposition of the one or the other. And again, open question, not so concrete. But it is in this. But I do think that this program in particular deals with the notion of that extreme emotional encounter, and how do we manage to formulate it in the language that we are, as artists, trying to manifest.
Briefly, thanks for the question, and I think that was the cruxes of or the difficulties I faced when I was editing Cabinet. There was just so many contradictions to what I was feeling, and like this is probably a more emotive film than any of the kind of work that I usually do. I'm a daughter of my dad, so kind of just is by virtue of the subject matter. But I couldn't go from A to B, B to C. It was just all over the place. It was one tangent after another, and it was. I was working with a dear friend who also passed, named Stacy Doris. She's a poet, and she wrote a lot of work on the images that I was sending her over time, and I was cutting to her words. She was writing to these cuts in just an effort to sort of strike out in the dark and see where I could go. And none of it was working, and I just had to follow these tangents that led me to this to just finding metaphors from other stuff that I shot. There's a screaming that was going on while this nipple is weeping of a man who's from a film that we were shooting in North Africa in this psychiatric facility, where every time the one of the doctors would leave this grown man, he would just scream. It was this like level of separation anxiety that I'd never experienced. And it was incredible, and the audio just felt, it illustrated what I was going on when I'd wake up. Like when you wake up from a nightmare and you're like, oh, you could have the luxury of saying that's a dream, but every time I woke up with my dad dying, it was still there. It wasn't a dream. This, finding these sounds that would illustrate what was going on with me, finding the other sort of adjacent images. So I've meandered a little bit off topic, but you get the idea. Sorry.
No, it's good. It is exactly it. It's the encounter with the otherness that kind of forces us to maybe. I mean, there was also this element, I forget exactly in which films it was, but this like trying to encounter sound with absolute silence. I've noticed maybe in a couple of your films, there's moments where there's almost absolute silence, which I find it relevant to this question as well.
Certainly striking in Felicity's.
Yeah. Well, I can add a little to it. Just particularly working with Kathy Acker's work. Her approach to, she was just kind of constantly in battle with language and trying to understand really through her work how those who controlled images and those who controlled language also controlled reality. And what she was doing was basically using language in order to construct a new reality, right? And that's something I was a language studies major. I've done language in all my many different sort of trainings, and there's a limit to it, And I think part of when you're going through something, I'm just speaking from personal experience. There is only so much that you can say, as opposed to like what can be felt. It's just about the experience of the body, and there's just so much that cannot actually be expressed with words, at least not within any of the Western languages that I speak. And so I think that's part of where what I was trying to do also is thinking more about like how can sometimes it can open up and make things a little bit more clear, like what these uncomfortable truths are that I've had to deal with. And then in other ways, I think it also can be utilized to help convey again like this murkiness, this unknowingness, this I just don't know what is going to happen next feeling. Yeah, and I think that was also, you know, kind of portrayed, like I heard it in these recordings that you had in your film, Callie, and you know, I think like these sort of same sort of elements of how we use language to construct reality in our own ways as artists is coming through in your work as well, Bruno, Todd. I mean, it was in each of the films.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. So I was about thinking about language too, because that's how I was kind of constructing the first half of my film with all of the like regulations in North Carolina for abortion access. And as I was researching through different websites like RAIN or Planned Parenthood, there was just so many restrictions that, and they were so awful or just like hard to kind of grapple with that one, if I just kind of like read them all out or wrote them all out, it would be like a 20-minute film of just restrictions, which is interesting in itself. So I kind of wanted to overlap the voice to kind of make this uncomfortable, confused state, especially because you can kind of hear like specific words here and there that maybe not won't make sense. Like there's some restrictions in North Carolina about like janitorial closets and like the width of hallways, things like you wouldn't really think of. So kind of like building this world of overlapping voices, and then it kind of calms once we get into talking more about like traditional practices and matrilineality and the tribes and having that free will and like power in yourself.
Yeah. In my case, I think language was precisely like the question of how to express something that is very personal, and then the haptics become a consequence of seeing something uh, so close that something that is small to everyone suddenly becomes so big because it feels big to me at some point, you know. So I feel like the images kind of convey this feeling, I think.
I'm working at it.
My question is for Todd. I was wondering, when I was watching your film, um, I was getting the feeling that this film is totally archival, made from material that you've gleaned from here and there. And then in the end credits, I saw like thanks to Rick Brellinger archive. And then you mentioned that you shot a lot of material for the film. So on a basic level, I'm curious about, you know, what was the process of like moving from original footage that you've shot and footage that you basically gleaned from here and there. But I was also thinking of, you know, in a lot of films that are made from like archival material or found footage, there's a process of like recasting or repurposing the material that you're gleaning from somewhere and turning it into your own material. But knowing that a lot of this was actually shot by you, I was thinking that there is maybe like a reverse process involved, that you're kind of like turning your original footage, original material into something of an archival or found nature. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks. I love it. Maybe not right after I said, okay, we're going to call this a wrap and I'm going to start entering into festivals. But certainly now, which is some years later, you know, recut since my mom had passed, I re-edited to bring her a little bit to the forefront. But in terms of the archivalness of it, it feels like I've forgotten a lot. You know, if I went back and looked at the original untreated, I wouldn't recognize it. I'm thinking this is, that's, you know, history. And it's very interesting. I kind of rewrote this for myself to be more, as I said earlier, acceptable to digest emotionally. And in terms of the Prellinger credit, There's one image in there that, in just going through, making a list of what I wanted to include that would just embellish my, the fond memories I had of my childhood. There was this, dating myself now, that our porch had a little box that had like two little bottles of milk that had the little foil tops to it, and I really wanted to do something with that. And I could have recreated that, just shot it and made it look old, but I just started looking around at Pallinger Archives, and there it was. I saw it, but also it had these flies on it, and in using the images of my daughters, getting this idea of a life cycle with death and birth, milk and flies were about as it was going to be, and so I just appropriated that into it. That was the only image from the archives. But thanks for noticing that. Thanks for for doubting me. Thanks for doubting that the imagery. Doubt images.
Oh, I'm good. I wasn't. I don't know. I think that's certainly the thread here. In some major ways, is that what we see is not always so real. I think this is the end of our Q&A portion. Thank you so much for joining us, Celine, Bruno, Todd. Really, really appreciate it, and what a privilege to have shown your work. Everyone in the audience, we will be back in this room at 4 p.m. for another wonderful program. Thank you for joining us.